черный день, усталый танец, пьяный глаз, дырявый круг. Второй упал, четвертый сел, восьмого выбили на круг. На провода из-под колес, да на три буквы из-под асфальта в тихий омут буйной головой. В холодный пот расходятся круги.
We're going to devote our energies to sports and gardening, all the cultural pursuits as far as they're concerned. In fact, we're going to put the goons to sleep. Meanwhile, we dig.
Here we go again.
Greetings and welcome to the Anadrome. This is Burn Power, coming to you on a bright Tbilisi June day with something a little different for you, and that is I have recovered something from my archive that I thought I would share with you. Back in 2011, January 7th to be precise, I recorded an interview with Alina Simone. Now, Alina was working with PRI's The World, which was a afternoon news program coming from the East Coast, from Massachusetts, as part of the public radio network. She had sent out a CD of her album, which was dedicated to a Russian singer I had never heard of, named Yanka Dyagileva. And it was entitled, Everyone is Crying Out to Me, Beware. And I listened to this and I was stunned by the songs. Alina has a beautiful voice with a lot of power to it as well. But she was pointing at someone else, this Russian folk punk singer who had passed away just as the Russians were slipping off the Soviet yoke. This person was a last generation kind of samizdat, which is the underground communications network of the Soviet Union. Last generation of like punk singers of that scene. And so I thought, it would be interesting to communicate with her. And since I was working in radio myself at KHNS in Haines, Alaska, I got in touch with her through radio channels, and we decided to have a conversation. So what you're going to hear is this telephone conversation from that period. Plus, I've spiced it in with a little bit of Yanka's music and Alina's music as well, just to give you an idea. Now, to tell you a little bit about Alina, and I will let her tell you much more about Yanka. Alina was actually born in Kharkiv during the Soviet Union, which later became Ukraine. She had to come with her father, who was having, shall we say, serious problems as a theoretical physicist working for the Soviet system. So they ended up in Massachusetts, where, there's a lot of intellectual work going on, particularly in areas like physics. So she went to school, learned English, doesn't have a trace of any sort of Russian accent left. But she ended up in Austin, in Texas, for university, and then kind of moved into the world of broadcasting. She was a street busker in Austin. Besides being a singer and a commentator on the radio. She is also a writer and has at least 3 books out. So, a very interesting person all on her own. But this person she was pointing to was someone I had never heard of. And I know a fair amount about the musical life behind the Iron Curtain. But this one had slipped my knowledge. And the reason is because it slipped everybody. And I was really grateful that Alina had run into her music during one of her travels back to Russia and back to Siberia. And had brought this music. Now, the way she interprets it is very different from the way Yanka herself was singing. Yanka was much more a very aggressive singer. There are different recordings. Most of her recordings are recorded in traditionally low-quality indie style, which doesn't make them any less interesting at all, or beautiful, or aggressive. And she sometimes would just sing as some of the visuals. I've found a couple of visuals of her singing. Sometimes it's just her and acoustic guitar. But when she was with a band, oh my goodness, they rocked. And I just played you a piece of that prior to my talking here. That was Yanka Dyagileva. Whereas the interpretation by Alina is much more, what should we say? It's almost like this lost world of a lost soul. And there is so much in Yanka's work, and you can slow it down or speed it up and interpret it. But I was fascinated. I found about 3 albums of her material, which are now impossible to find. I have the recordings on my computer here, but I have the actual records back in Alaska, which I need to get here, but that's another story. But Alina's albums, besides the one dedicated to Yanka Dyagileva, she also has one called Prettier in the Dark, Make Your Own Danger, and another one that I really love called Raw Demos. And I believe this is the demos that have the early versions of the Yanka Dyagileva tunes, which are, I appreciate this album. I think the actual album, Everyone is Crying Out for Me to Beware, is a great album. And I think the production and everything is great. But her demos are interesting because they reinterpret the songs in a more raw way, in a way more sympathetic to Yanka herself. Yanka was nothing if not lo-fi. So, but I will let her, in our conversation, we start off talking about, well, who's Alina Simone? Tell me about Russia. Tell me about the background. Then we go into her discovery of Yanka, and we spend a while talking about that. And finally, then we talk about how she chose to interpret the songs. And I think if you are, and we talk a bit about the Siberian punk scene, which very few people know about. There is, in fact, a kind of ramshackle documentary on the subject, which I found, and I'm putting links to that both below and at the very end of this video. You'll see a link to it. So, new information for if you thought you knew everything about punk rock and everything about this. No, you don't. There's always something. And this stuff is really fascinating. So I hope you appreciate it. And let's go and meet Alina, who will then introduce us to Yanka.
So, can you hear me? Can you hear me?
Yes, I can. Can you hear me?
Yeah, no, I can. I put up the wrong one. Okay, so anyway, we just have a regular phone conversation and then talk about that. But so you actually came from Russia. How old were you?
Well, I was born in the Soviet Union. It was the Soviet Union back then, in what is now Ukraine.
Right. Do you? So that is, I read what there was a little thing you written somewhere about your changing your last name.
Oh yeah, I did change my last name. I changed it from my dad's last name to my mom's last name, so it wasn't really such a huge change. Right.
But nevertheless, but so I'm guessing you're kind of like, I don't know, do you consider it Russian, Ukrainian, Jewish, American, What do you identify most with?
That's a tough one because I'm kind of a mutt, so I feel like I just identify as Russian. My dad's Jewish and my mom isn't, and, my family's, from all different parts of the former Soviet Union. My grandfather was Romanian. So I guess I just identify as Russian because that's the language I grew up speaking, and those are the foods I grew up eating, and that's the culture I'm accustomed to. And there's really no other element in my upbringing that was uniform in terms of, there was no Judaism, and there was really no, no other elements. It was just about Russian language, Russian culture.
Right. So, did you, you're in New York City right now, right? That's where you're living?
Yeah, Brooklyn.
Yeah. What part?
South Park Slope.
Okay. I have friends who live there. I lived in the city for 16 years. So,
oh, yeah, you mentioned that in your email. Mm-hmm.
Pretty familiar with, the city and such. I guess you go out every now and then to Brighton Beach and for a little Russian stuff.
Yeah, sometimes I go there. I have a really good friend who I grew up with who's also Russian. And we were the only two Russian kids in our elementary school. Mm-hmm. And now he lives down the street from me, so every once in a while, he'll call me and say, let's go to Brighton Beach.
Yeah, I used to go out there.
Yeah, cool.
I had different Russian friends, and I would go down there. Sometimes I'd just go down by myself. Sometimes I'd take friends with me and wander through different stores and such. One time I wandered into what I thought was a movie theater, but it turned out to be someone's wedding ceremony. And,
oh, wow.
And so here I was in the middle, and everyone was dressed how Americans dress, and how Russians dress. So it was just cheapers, what am I doing here? Let's get out.
Yeah, well, Brighton Beach doesn't really resemble Russia in any way. I mean, it's this weird, it's this weird zone of its own, it's sort of more Soviet than Russian at this point, where you just go there and you see fashions and foods and stuff that you don't find in Russia anymore, people don't dress like that in Russia anymore.
Right.
So it's pretty funny, because I've spent a lot of time in Russia, recently. I mean, within the past 10 years, and Brighton Beach is a different animal altogether.
Yes, I went to. I've got Polish and Ukrainian heritage, among other things, and I've made it as far as Poland, and I got up to Krakow, and I said, I'm just kind of really close to Ukraine. I could slip into there, and I said, no, I've got to save Russia and Ukraine for. It's just it's the ultimate goal is to get in there, and but I've been a bit of a Russophile for quite a while, as well as liking French and English culture, and of course American culture. But I think I can trace it to reading all three of Solzhenitsyn's Gulag archipelagos when I was around 21 or so.
Oh wow, that's hardcore.
Yeah,
those are long books.
They are.
I read Volume 1.
Yeah, Volume 2. Volume 1's the really tough one to get through. Volume 2 is the one with the most meat, and Volume 3 is actually the most exciting one.
Oh, really? Because Volume 1 kind of read a bunch of lists.
Exactly.
It was very.
Yeah.
It was hard to get through, and it didn't make me want to read Volumes 2 and 3. So,
right.
Knowing that makes me.
Well, if you want to save yourself time and cut to the core of the book, just go to Volume 2 and read the chapter called The Ascent, where he talks about renouncing the goal of surviving at any cost in the Gulag, and what that did to him once he came to that conclusion that it wasn't about survival, it was about being human, and it's pretty amazing stuff. Mm-hmm. But then later I discovered Tarkovsky, and over the years I've discovered things like you must have heard the Ukrainians.
Must have heard what? Sorry?
The group, the Ukrainians.
I didn't catch. I'm sorry. There's a siren here.
I understand. Yeah, I hear it. It's New York. Every time I go back to the city, it's the first thing I notice is all the sirens. Because where I'm living now is just as quiet as you can possibly imagine.
I'm sure.
But no, there's actually English-based group made of part English and part Ukrainian people called the Ukrainians.
Oh, isn't that it's what's that band? It's a spin-off
From
of
the
a
Wedding
really
Present.
big band.
From the Wedding
Right?
Present. The Wedding Present wasn't that huge.
Yeah, the wedding party.
Yeah. Wedding. I thought it was Wedding Present.
The Wedding Present. Okay, well, I've played with them. I opened for them once in France, and I don't know if I knew about the Ukrainians then because I didn't talk to them about it. You know what I mean? Like, I think if I had known, I would have said something to them.
Oh, yeah.
But so I mean, I have because I'm a musician. I'm a musician,
Right.
obviously mainly, but. It was a while back, but so yeah, I've heard of the Ukrainians, but I haven't listened to their music.
You know what I'll do is I've been kind of I also have been studying music history for ages, particularly popular music history, but I've been making CDs for friends. Well, I make them for myself to listen to mostly, but I make them for friends too. Of like, and one of the little sets I've made is just of Eastern European, like folk punk and stuff.
Oh, okay.
And so, like, Gogol Bordello kind of fits in that. And
they're great. Yeah.
Have you heard
really
the Warsaw Village Band? Have you heard them?
No.
They're just absolutely mind-blowing. They're just, I mean, when I heard this one album of theirs called The People's Spring, it was kind of like, you know, like just the introduction, the first song on the album, it's kind of like, imagine what comes next. There's absolutely no way you can. It's like it starts off with this kind of slow, like just single tom-tom build up. And then it gets like more and more, and then all of a sudden these horns come in, and then the girls come and they're singing with this like super echoey sound, which is kind of a variation on what they sing in the Tatra Mountains, and it's just, I mean, I just completely bowled over by the thing. And but anyway, what I'll do is I'll send you a CD that I put together of some of this stuff.
Oh, sure, I'd love that.
Yeah, because I think given your interest, you might find some inspiration in there somewhere.
Yeah.
But anyway, so tell me how. So obviously you were thoroughly Americanized. I hear no Russian accent going on here. So
right.
How did you? And just from the little I have read that you've either written or about you, you obviously kind of, what was it? Just didn't. You didn't identify with Russia growing up all that much. I assume you spoke it enough to rekindle it once you got going again. But so when did you start getting reinterested in Russia?
Well, I grew up during the Cold War, so, you know, it wasn't really a time that was very welcoming for Russian Americans. I mean, it was really, you know, the Reagan 80s and, you know, a lot of, you know, news on TV about the nuclear threat and stuff like that. So, so I think a lot of it was just societal, you know, my not being into, I was very, like, kind of embarrassed of my Russian heritage, you know, at least externally, because my family was 100% Russian. I mean, you know, my grandparents emigrated when I was 5, and they didn't even speak a lot of English, and within my house, it was just like, you know, Russian was spoken, Russian food was eaten, like, Russian literature is what was read, you know, like, people played chess, like, and they, you know, that it was just like a little piece of Russia, and that was completely uncool to the rest of, you know, my American friends. I grew up in
what kind of
Lexington, Massachusetts, which is like, you know, the birthplace of American liberty. So it felt like a very American place, even though it was pretty liberal.
What kind of music did you listen to? When you first discovered music in America, what kind of music did you start listening?
Oh, I was listening to just, like, top 40 80s pop, like Madonna, Michael Jackson, Cyndi Lauper. I mean,
yeah,
you know, where I lived, there were, you know, like 3 main radio stations. They all played pretty much the same thing. Like, I grew up in the suburbs, so there wasn't a lot. There was no live music where I grew up. There was no, bars where people played. There were no bars. It was just like a dry town. So like, it was just mass culture.
And
That's
and
what we
by
had
that
access to.
by that standard, if you're listening to pop music in the 80s, Russia would be totally uncool.
Yeah. Well, Russia was behind, though. They were probably still in folk music mode in our 80s, and then in the 90s, they're always sort of like 10 years behind the trend,
Right.
So I think they got their synth pop on a little later. But so it was really not until I got to college. I mean, the Soviet Union fell apart in '91. And that's like just before I graduated high school.
Mm-hmm.
And so then I felt like, in college and really after college is when I started really thinking, oh God, this is like a really unique thing about me that I should try to preserve, because my children aren't going to, probably speak Russian or have that much connection to Russia. I'm married to an American, and so I just re-educated myself. I mean, I had a pretty good comprehension of like kitchen table Russian, just the kind of Russian that's spoken around the house.
Right.
But I was completely lost if I looked at a news show or a newspaper or anything like that. So I started actually just by applying for jobs that required Russian, because I figured that would force me to, I could read, I was just very slow, and I could speak, but I was just out of practice and my vocabulary wasn't very good.
Right.
So I just went kind of the immersion route. I found a job that sent me to Russia, basically.
Cool.
And so it was running a small alternative to the Peace Corps program that covered a part of Russia that the Peace Corps didn't cover. It was in Siberia, actually.
Mm-hmm.
And so they just, I got this job, and then within a month, they sent me to one of the most remote regions of Siberia for a month. And I'd never been back to Russia.
Which region?
Were, totally appalled because they just couldn't believe I was, skipping Moscow and St. Petersburg, or even, Kharkov, where I was born and where my family is.
Right.
And going to, this armpit of,
where was it, exactly?
Of the Soviet Union. Mm-hmm.
Which part of Siberia?
Yeah. Oh, what part of Siberia?
Yeah.
It's called Chita, and what it's known for, to the extent that it's known now, is Khodorkovsky was being imprisoned there.
Right. Yeah, I just saw there's an interesting BBC documentary that was done by Richard Dimbleby. I don't think it exists in America yet. I got a British DVD of it, and he went to the town where he's imprisoned.
It's a city, actually.
Yeah, city, and that was really fascinating, actually.
Yeah, it's pretty. It's a fascinating place. I've actually another job I took later sent me there again, so I ended up back there, for another 10 days or something. A few years later, I was I never thought I'd be back here. It's very remote. It's a formerly closed city because it has an army base. I think it's been scaled down quite a bit, but it's on the border of China.
Right.
And Russia, and it's a very strategically kind of important place, and they've got, I think, uranium mining there and other sensitive industries. So it's actually a city that was not on Soviet maps. It wasn't on the map. You couldn't see it until the Soviet Union collapsed. And they literally it was a closed city. You needed a special visa to travel there, so it was a place that very, very few Westerners ever went. And even when I went there, they'd had a few Westerners, but we're talking still probably in the 2 digits. It was very weird.
Right.
Because it was a very insular, remote, isolated, and poor, place.
Right. So
so that was my introduction. That was my reintroduction to Russia, a month in Chita. And then even more exotically, we had some schools in the Buryat Autonomous District, which is sort of akin to our Native American reservations. The Buryats are
tribal,
Mongolian by descent, but they've been living in Russia for centuries, and their language has sort of evolved into a hybrid of Mongolian and Russian, and they're practicing Buddhists, and they've been given, these autonomous regions where they have sort of more control of the government.
Did you make it? Did you make it out to the weird little Jewish autonomous region out there?
There's one in the Far East.
Right.
There's the Jewish autonomous. I think it's been totally decimated, and there are very, very, very few Jews there. I think it's like historically, there were Jews that were basically sent there at one point.
Right.
But by now, most of them have left, and there are very few.
Right. But it still has some Jewish flavor to it. And in this documentary by Jonathan Dimbleby, he actually goes there and shows people still practicing their faith. But of course, he does point out that, Stalin decided, yes, you're going to have a Jewish autonomous zone, and then got really suspicious of them for all getting together.
Yeah, well, I think a lot of them immigrated to Israel. I think that's what, because...
Right.
Or Germany. There are just so many more incentives to live abroad for Russian Jews, and they had the opportunity to leave when other people didn't. So a lot of them took that opportunity. But that place is very far away from Chita. That's in the Far East.
Yes, Siberia is big.
Ocean, and Chita is more just smack dab in the middle, like just above China, in Mongolia.
So when did you first had you already, while you were going back at that point, had you heard of Yanka yet?
Not the first time. Not the first time I went to Russia. I think I heard of her a few years later, and it was actually in Brighton Beach because I was wandering around there. It was just after I'd moved to New York, and I encountered these Russian street musicians, and they were just playing. I don't know what they were playing, probably like Vysotsky or something. Like, one guy was American and one guy was Russian, and they were just sitting on the corner singing songs, and I struck up a conversation with them, and they said, oh, you should come to the Elbow Room, which is a club that's now closed in the village that used to have a lot of Russian rock, and we're going to go to this show, you should come. And so I went, and the American guy had made me a cassette tape because it was still like a time when you could make someone a cassette tape.
What year was
even
that?
Even though it was the 2000s, it was sort of like just the end of the cassette era. And he made me a mix of Yanka's music, And he was like, I think you'd really like this. I told him I was a singer. And so that's the first time I heard of her.
And it must have struck you. Her music must have struck you pretty strongly at that point, or soon thereafter.
Oh yeah, I'd never imagined there was something like that in Russia because, all the Russian music I'd heard, it was either to me really cheesy sounding, like 80s music, or it was like the old folk music that my parents listened to, like Vysotsky. And Yanka she sounded kind of like me, like this like lonely, angry girl in her room just making do with what she had, which is what I did for a really long time. So it's sort of, I loved the melodies of her songs and I loved her voice, but I think that personally I just felt this connection to her because it was clear, she just had this crappy guitar, and she barely knew how to play it, like she had her 5 chords or whatever. And, but she was just hell-bent on expressing herself, like, by whatever means necessary. And you could really hear that in the songs, like, it's so raw and immediate and passionate. So that's what really drew me to her music and intrigued me, that there was, that there could have been such a person even in the Soviet era. Because I just didn't think anything cool happened in the Soviet Union,
Right.
Like anything I would consider, like, cool, like, like subculture.
Well, yeah, and she's like a product of the very last generation of Soviet culture.
Right.
And also it strikes me she's probably somewhere near your age. That is to say, it sounds like a couple years older, but
I think she was probably like 7 or 8 years older. She was born in, I think she's eight years older than me. I think she was born in 1966.
Right.
And I was born in 74, so.
Okay. Well, it's within a decade. So.
Yeah.
What did you do? Did you start trying to get information about her, or when next time you went back to Russia, did you pick up any? Did you get on her track somehow? Try to figure something out?
Like slowly. I mean, not right away, but my work eventually sent me to Novosibirsk, which is where she's from. And so I did start kind of asking, I made friends there, Russian friends, obviously, and I did start to kind of ask them, and they all knew, and actually they are a little older than I am, and they all knew kind of where she hung out, where she had played, where her dormitory was. There was, a little record store there, and they were like, oh, you could probably pick up a Yanka t-shirt in there somewhere, so that kind of information, but I didn't get deep into it until after I decided to make the album.
Right.
After I decided to make the album, then I continued to work in international development, and I continued to travel to Novosibirsk, and then, with that mission in mind, that's when I started to really dig and really, seek out people who knew her and, go visit the places that, where she had lived and where her grave was and places she had performed and stuff like that.
Yeah, it strikes me. I mean, just listening to her music and what little I've been able to glean. I was able to use the Google translation tool to access some of the Yanka page. Although it's always really funny because if you know Russian and you know English, so just how strange putting the two together is.
Yeah, they're really different.
Yeah, it's. I almost came up with this idea doing that kind of thing, that the Russian version of the self is so different than the American version of the self, or the English-speaking version, because we're always referring to ourselves, whereas the Russians seem to be referring to itself, or something like that.
Well, Russians use the passive voice a lot. I mean, that's sort of like the default mode of communication, which is very odd sounding to American ears.
Yeah.
But I agree that the two languages are really different and incompatible in many ways. It's a tough translation.
Right. So you're actually in a very fortunate spot. And her lyrics
are practically untranslatable anyways.
Right.
So
it's tough because that helps me to understand why Americans and Russians have such a tough time understanding each other, is because they're seeing the world, you see the world through your language, and they're seeing the world through such a different language. Their grid is so different than our grid, and so that makes it tough to understand certain principles. Not that ultimately you can't get along; you certainly can, but it does make it difficult just on the surface, at least.
Sure.
So what did you? Tell me more about what you discovered about her in terms of what she's, it seems like she went through this period where she was kind of got into music. I guess before you tell me more about her, tell me more about, did you learn much about how her music was distributed in terms of how people recorded it, or how did she record it?
I mean, it was recorded on a variety of cassette media. I think there was some kind of reel-to-reel thing when she did her quote-unquote real recordings with Igor Letov. And then there was a guy in St. Petersburg who also recorded her on, something more professional for the time and for the Soviet Union. But the output was basically cassette tapes that were circulated by hand. I know that some of her music was just basically recorded on a boombox, hit record. So, by the U.S. standards, even at that time, it would have been very rudimentary stuff. And it sounds that way. The distribution was all done, as it was all magnetizator, self-release, self-distributed. She supposedly, I think, was offered a deal from Melodia. There was only one record label in the Soviet Union, which was the state-run label called Melodia,
Right, I'm
which is
familiar with
obviously
them.
controlled by the government. And I think I'd have to check my notes, but I think that she refused to be distributed by Melodia. I mean,
Would they have
presumably
put? They would have
vinyl
probably.
or something.
They probably would have put a lot of restrictions on what she was doing. Right?
Yeah, I mean, I think she was not into, you know, I wouldn't say, like, her songs aren't really political. If anything, she seems sort of just, like, anti-political, but I'm sure she was anti the regime.
Sure.
Personally. Even, you know, I think her songs contain a lot of dark imagery of communists, you know, slogans and cliches and stuff like that.
What
And
do you
just
mean?
the way she lived her life was pretty much, you know, like a middle finger in the face of the regime. I mean, you know, she didn't give interviews, so there's nothing. You can't really find some statement that she's made about, you know, her impressions of the Soviet government or anything like that. There's very little left that's sort of a primary document.
It's all basically her music.
It's her songs and it's secondhand, you know, testimony and just very few snippets of, you know, things she said that people transcribed.
So was she? Do you think she was like really angry or more depressive or?
No, I think she was a hippie. I think that because the hippie movement hit the Soviet Union late, and the late, you know, the Perestroika era and just thereafter was sort of the Russian hippie era.
Right.
And, you know, where people just traveled around and acted weird and got liberated. And I think that she was, you know, in that movement.
Yeah.
And
I often tell my friends that the 50s lasted for at least 30 years in Russia.
yeah. Yeah. So, I mean, I think that she was, you know, like, I don't think she was necessarily an angry person. Her music is very passionate and you know, and it's punk, so, you know, it has that element to it. But from what I've been able to glean about her personally, like, I think that she was, you know, like, she was in this movement and that she had, you know, a lot of friends and a lot of people really loved her. I think that she had, like, psychological problems. I think she had a problem with depression. And, you know, and unfortunately, like, the group of people that she spent a lot of time traveling around with, like Igor Letov and his band, these were very hard-drinking, hard-living, you know, hard people to be around. I mean, Igor Letov, in my estimation, you know, regardless of his artistic achievement, it seems like kind of an asshole. And, you know, a very difficult personality, very controlling. And so, you know, just my amateur opinion is that, you know, she had a problem with depression and she was in an unforgiving world, you know, with the group of people that weren't equipped to help her, and she just didn't have anyone to reach out to, and just went back to Siberia and became increasingly more isolated and eventually killed herself. And it's very sad. I mean, you have the sense that, you know, things easily could have been different if she just had, like, that one friend or that one, you know, family member that understood what was going on.
Right. I've heard, I see that there's, like, it seems like there's three different streams of opinion about what happened to her at the end. One is that she slipped in accidentally into the water. The other is that she threw herself in, and the third is that someone pushed her in. And
yeah, I mean, my guess would be that she killed herself. I didn't want to say that in my liner notes because so few people know her, you know, in the U.S., that I really felt like I was writing some kind of history, you know, some kind of document that would be referred to as the truth or something. Just not because I'm any kind of authority, but there's just so little in English about her
Well, you
that
are.
I knew I'd write this and it would circulate.
Well, you are at this moment probably the most authoritative person in the English language on her, simply because of what you said. No one knows who she is, and I'm just trying to figure it out because I just from what I've heard of through your songs and seeing your translations of her lyrics, and then listening to the music itself that I've been able to download. It's just like it doesn't matter the quality of the actual recordings. What matters is what's there, and it's pretty.
Oh, of course.
It's pretty astounding.
Yeah, I mean, I there are people in Russia who are Russian, but whose English is very good, who are far more authorities than on Yanka than I am. And I've spoken to those people. So it's not that I'm the only person who speaks good English who's an expert on Yanka. It's just that those people aren't writing in English about her. They're writing in Russian about her. And so, I didn't want to say she killed herself because I didn't want to make that, the truth, basically make that de facto kind of her storyline in English. But I will say that based on my research, her father, who she killed her, she died at her father's dacha, which is in this little village, outside of Novosibirsk by the river. And so her father and her stepmother were there, and her father believes it was a suicide. That's what he thinks, and he was the one who was there at the time. Also, the last songs that she wrote, which I couldn't bring myself to cover, they were released kind of separately on their own little album. But the last 4 songs she wrote before she killed herself, one of them, the chorus is, "The water will come and I will sleep." And, the whole song, it really sounds like a suicide note, which is, when I first heard it, that's what I thought. And then later I read her father's recollections, there's this big book just called Yanka, and it's all in Russian. And it's just basically a collection of interviews with people who knew her, and concert reviews and stuff like that, just any documentation that exists. And so this long interview with her father, he says he also considers that song kind of her suicide note. But her last songs, they were very dark and seemed to allude, almost literally to suicide. And so I feel like there's enough evidence that you could that would be the logical conclusion. But this was a time when the Soviet Union was unraveling, and there was a lot more violence and just marauders around. And so some people do think, well, she's walking in the woods, she was by herself, maybe someone came along, and something happened. But there's no proof of that, really.
Right. Well, plus, I think Russians, like a good many people, like to speculate about, different scenarios, especially if in that case it is kind of mysterious that, because no one was there.
Yeah, people do that here, too. No matter how clear-cut a death seems to be, they say, well, maybe it was this, Kurt Cobain or Elliott Smith or Jeff Buckley, it's pretty normal. So, but those are my 2 cents.
Yeah, well, if she's writing a song about, the cold water taking her away, that I often find that before people do something, you have to imagine it first. That is to say that, it's just like, I've done quite a bit of study on just people, before they commit horrendous crimes, they have to start seeing it in their head. That you just don't, it doesn't just, serial killer just doesn't wake up one morning, decide to kill someone. He fantasizes for a while. And it's the same with, most things we do, whether good or bad, we come up with the image first. And it sounds like she'd come up with the image of, what the water would do for her. And what I know is living in Alaska, our rivers here are about 37 degrees all year round. And, living in that kind of environment, knowing that, what cold water does, having once fallen in, I would just say, if you know what that feels like, what kind of death that would be. And it would actually not be the most painful death in the world. It would, no death is good in that sense, but you could come up with some sort of romanticism, a dark, fatal romanticism about drowning in those kind of conditions, because the cold would take you away within 5 minutes or so. So. So tell me, when you first started hearing her music, I mean, obviously you liked it, but it sounds like it took you several years before you started getting a little bit more, shall we say, obsessed about it or something like that?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it grew on me over time. I mean, I just sort of listened to it more and more, and then I decided that I wanted to make this cover album, but I didn't really know when I would make it. And I was living in North Carolina at the time, and I had a friend applying for a grant from the Durham Arts Council. And she was like, apply with me. And I was like, well, I'm not like a painter or anything. And she was like, yeah, but, isn't there some weird arty music project you've always, thought about doing? And I was like, no, there's actually this one. And I really, I didn't think I'd get it, and I didn't, I just kind of threw it out there, and I got the grant. And so then all of a sudden I had a timeline, I had a deadline, and I had some money. So I took it a lot more seriously after that.
North Carolina doesn't seem exactly related to Russia, but it sounds great that they did that.
Yeah, no, I mean, it was very cool because only a couple of musicians got grants, and I was really excited that they went for it.
This is just on a personal note. I have friends in North Carolina. Did you ever meet someone named Jessamine Hyatt?
No, that doesn't sound familiar.
It doesn't?
Mm-mm.
Okay, just wondering. You never know.
Sure.
But yeah, the Raleigh-Durham, Chapel Hill area does have quite a... it is an interesting area culturally in the States these days, and I find that fascinating.
Не догонишь, не поймаешь, не догнал, не воровали, без труда не выбьешь зубы, не продашь, не наебешь. Эту песню не задушишь, не убьешь. Эту песню не задушишь, не убьешь. Дом горит, козел не видит, дом горит, козел не знает, что козлом на свет родился, за козла и отвечать. Гори, гори, ясно, чтобы не погасло. Гори, гори, ясно, чтобы не погасло. На дороге я валялась, грязь слезами разбавляла. Разорвали новую юбку, да заткнули ею рот. Славься, великий рабочий народ, непобедимый могучий народ. Дом горит, козел не видит, он напился и подрался. Он не помнит, кто кого козлов впервые обозвал. Гори, гори, ясно, чтобы не погасло. Гори, гори, ясно, чтобы не погасло. Лейся, песня на просторе, залетай в печные трубы, рожки-ножки черным дымом по красавице земле. Солнышко смеется громким красным смехом. Гори, гори, ясно, чтобы не погасло. Гори, гори, ясно, чтобы не погасло. Гори, гори, ясно, чтобы не погасло. Гори, ясно, чтобы не погасло.
So the punk scene, or what? Well, I don't know if punk scene is the right word, or hippie scene, or it sounds like they were just getting. I mean, obviously they didn't have open market to just buy whatever punk singles or whatever singles were music was coming out of America or England, and a lot of it was probably coming in on tapes. Eugene Hoots from Gogol Bordello talks about how they used to. They had some process of actually recording the grooves of like a record onto the backs of X-ray plates, and that's how they would listen to some songs,
Wow, I've never heard that.
Yeah, it was called Music on the Bones, but evidently the plastic on X-rays was, malleable enough that you could cut a record with it, like if you had a record cutting machine.
Wow.
And, so some stuff was passed around like that. I'm really fascinated with, rock music and kind of alternative forms of music during the Soviet era in different Eastern European countries. And like in the Czech Republic, there's the Plastic People of the Universe, and there was a couple of interesting groups in Poland, one called Holy Toy, which did some very fascinating, like cut and paste kind of music way before anybody else was doing it. And I always found it interesting because it always sounded like they were misinterpreting certain aspects of what they were listening to in such a great way. So much great music has come from misinterpretation of what you thought someone else was doing. Mm-hmm. And but do you know what kinds of? Do you have any idea what music she was listening to?
Yeah, I know she really liked the Velvet Underground, and that was a big influence. I know that she was, deeply immersed in the Russian punk folk scene. So Sasha Bashlachev was a big influence on her. She was friends with him. He was a Russian kind of punk folk acoustic guy. He also killed himself. Obviously, Grazdanska Oborona, Igor Letov's band, Civil Defense. And she also went around to villages surrounding Novosibirsk by herself, recording old folk songs on like a little tape recorder. And several of these she covered a cappella, and the recordings exist. So, it was a really interesting mix of just like, Western stuff that she could get on the black market, and Russian punk and folk and traditional Russian music from a century ago.
Yeah, unfortunately, I haven't heard of much of this stuff because much of it was probably, not recorded officially. Do you know of any collections or any CDs anywhere that feature any of these groups or bands?
What do you mean? Which groups are
well,
bands?
the stuff from
the
that,
Russian ones?
the stuff from that period, either right before or right after the breakup of the Soviet Union. From that.
Oh, well, you can just. I don't know of any. I know there's actually this guy here in New York who's trying to get a record label to reissue all this stuff on vinyl or something. I've been in touch with him, but I don't think that's gone anywhere yet. If you just type into Google Sasha Bashlachev, I don't know exactly how to. Yeah, I mean, I got it right away. Just Sasha or Alexander, Bashlachev.
Spell
I'm sure you'll find.
Okay. Yeah.
I already found just something that looks like it's got a whole list of folks from that era, because it also includes Boris Grebenshchikov, who I think is the head singer of, I don't know, Aquarium or one of those old bands. Grazdanska Oborona, that's Igor Letov's band, Negative Land. So I think it's just a matter of doing a little Google searching.
Okay. Yeah, I'm just figuring out this stuff myself.
Grazdanska Oborona, the English translation is Civil Defense.
Okay.
But the lead singer's name is Igor Letov, Yegorletov.
Yeah, I've seen his name in association with Yanka. How do you say her last name officially?
Dyagileva.
Okay, that's what I thought.
Yeah, and so, but if you I think if you follow the thread on him, you'll come across a lot more names from that era and be able to dig up more stuff. But he was sort of, he's a really central figure. I mean, definitely in terms of the Siberian punk scene, he was the most important. And the Siberian punk scene was really influential in Western Russia, and, Moscow and St. Petersburg, because they were sort of seen as more raw and authentic and political because they were further from the center, so at least it was perceived that they had more freedom to express themselves than bands in Moscow would.
Right. So, what have you gleaned about Yanka's personality? I mean, we talked about her. Obviously, she had problems with depression, but in terms of just her kind of demeanor when she played in clubs, her basic day-to-day personality, not her more psychological problem aspects.
I think that's a pretty difficult thing to glean. I mean, without knowing her, and there are people alive who knew her. So I think, they would be the best people to talk to in terms of what she was really like. But it seems like she kind of shunned the spotlight. She was never as popular as, those other bands, as Dyagileva or, any of the bands of that era. She always kind of remained firmly in the underground, because there were official rock clubs. There were like 3 that were state sanctioned, and that you could have a show in, and there were also occasional festivals, but she very, very rarely played at these sort of official things, and she more just stuck to these very DIY people's living rooms or some university library or something like that, those kinds of shows.
Right.
And she lived very, very modestly. She did not wear makeup or heels or do any of the stuff that Russian women do. She wore boots and really simple clothes, and she seemed to have cared nothing about money and nothing about recognition. She didn't give interviews. So, I mean, you get the sense that she just, this is just something that she had to do. She was just obsessed with singing and, creating this art, and she did it for as long as she could, living a very peripatetic life. I mean, I'm sure she was a drinker. I'm sure she drank, because everyone around her drank, and I've heard from people who knew her. I don't know how trustworthy the sources, but that she drank. But it was rock and roll. Everyone drank. And so I don't know. I don't know if that helps.
Yeah, it does. One of the things, of course, it's difficult for me to see, and obviously you can read this much more clearly than I do, but what are the kind of themes in her music? What does she sing about? I assume mostly about her own feelings and such, but also does she wrestle with, believing in anything? Does she wrestle, does she have any concept of God? Does she see herself kind of, at the whim of forces of the world, or, what kind of things are running through her that it's difficult?
Well, her songs are really like surrealist poetry. I mean, it's not like a band like Kino or something where, you can just read the lyrics and it reads like a diary or something, and you're like, wow, this is, I just get this intimate little glimpse into your life and your beliefs, and this is like a short story. I mean, her lyrics, even for Russians, are extremely difficult to understand. There are really just these flashes and glimpses of images, and some of them make no sense, There's sort of like a tone to them, like a darkness, but some of them have humor. So it's really hard to I mean, there's that one song that I mentioned where the chorus is "The water will come," but that's an exception. You know what I mean? That's why it's really striking that there was something that so clearly alluded to her death.
Right.
I know that she was baptized, that she got herself baptized before she died to the Russian Orthodox Church. But that's not in any of her music, though. There is a song called "Stayi Letят" that refers a little bit to religion or, to icons. So in general, I translated, or I had translated the 9 songs that I covered into English.
Right.
So those are in the liner notes to my album, and it's sort of like, you can read them and draw your own conclusions. It's tough to really figure out exactly what she was trying to say. It's more just like flipping through faded Polaroids from the Soviet era, or from this era of perestroika. You know, it's just like one image after another, but there's not really a storyline.
I understand. Yeah, that's what I kind of gathered from looking at the translations on your album, and so did you ever feel like you were, was there a danger of getting too far into her world, do you think, or were you always happy to be there, or how did you approach that?
No, I got kind of unhappy to be there after a while because I was promoting the album for a year and a half, and I toured the U.S. and Europe and Russia, and I had to talk about her all the time. I did a lot of interviews, and towards the end, I really was starting to feel like I just had to get out of this, like that it was hard. It was hard singing her songs all the time. It was hard saying these words all the time, and it was hard to talk about her life all the time because it was very dark, I love it. I felt like it was culturally important, and it's something very close to me and that I loved, but I'd spent so long kind of in this tunnel that actually, like, the next project I did is I wrote a book. It's going to be published this June, and it's actually a funny book. And my editor was so shocked because he was like, "But you're, the dark girl," and, like, he just completely expected me to write some, like, gruesome novel, and I was like, "Nope, I'm not doing that anymore," or not for a long time.
Right. Did you ever write a book about your own journey through these things?
My own what? I'm sorry?
Your own journey through your Russian heritage and whatnot?
Well, that's what this book is.
Okay.
It's nonfiction. It's personal essays, but they're kind of more David Sedaris-y. So it's not to say that it's a joke book, but it's like, its tone is much closer to David Sedaris than,
more ironic distance.
Yeah. It's meant to be funny, but it's also factual. So I talk about Yanka. I have a chapter on Yanka, and I actually commissioned my friend Vladimir, who did the artwork for the vinyl edition of the album.
Is there a vinyl edition?
And
There's a vinyl edition?
Yeah, with an extra song on it.
Does it still exist?
Yeah.
I gotta find it.
Actually, the label just wrote to me today being like, "Could you make the link to us more prominent on your website?" It's like, we want to sell more copies, but I'm redoing my website right now, which is probably why it's all.
Well, I will go there and hunt it down because I'm a vinyl hound. So.
Oh, well, it's really amazing because the guy that did the artwork, it's like double gatefold, gorgeous printing, and he. My friend Vladimir Zimakov, he teaches, he's like the head of the graphic design department at, I forget if it's Cal Arts or, one of those. He's in LA. And he left Russia when he was 14, and he grew up listening to Yanka, and he loves Yanka. So it was really awesome to collaborate with him on this because he just did such a perfect job with the artwork. And then I commissioned him to do an 8-page sort of graphic novelization of her biography for my book, for that Yanka chapter. So there's this little, 8-page comic. The text is based on my liner notes, basically.
Right.
Because there's very little room for text. It's like it's a comic. But, it's just so beautifully drawn, and he did a great job. So that's in my book. So, my book is, a lot of it is about Russia and my experiences in indie rock and stuff like that. But it doesn't have the tone of a Yanka album. It doesn't, has a much lighter tone.
So did you sell many copies of the album?
I just don't know because they were, both the vinyl and the CD version were put out by different labels, and I don't know how much you know about the world of music, but the accounting these people give you
yes, I know quite a bit about the world of music.
Non-existent at best, or not to be believed, like if you get it. And I never got any accounting from anyone. And my label, the label that put out the CD went out of business. They went bankrupt last year. So like even getting get any information from them is impossible. But I mean, I'm sure it sold much better than anything else that I did because it got so much press.
Right.
And because I know that they seem to have very few copies left. There seem to be very few physical copies of the CDs left, which means they probably sold out or close to it of the run that they made, which was probably only like a couple of thousand. But that's the physical. That doesn't include the digital,
right,
or the vinyl.
Right. Yeah, it's a weird music world these days, and it seems like, I mean, just some, right now I'm working at this radio station. I just started working with the music department again, and I just got a notice from one of the promoters saying, yeah, as of the first of the year, we will not be sending you physical copies anymore, which made me think like, I really think it turns out the vinyl will probably survive longer than the CDs will.
Yeah, it is just so weird. I mean, I'm putting out my next album myself, and it is just like so weird. You just don't know what to do because it's clear that the vinyl is being kind of fetishized, and more likely to survive as a keepsake and as an art object. But yeah, there are still these people that want, a CD to put in their car radio, or, the promo people. I mean,
right.
I'm doing radio, and my radio guy says, nope, I need CDs. I need a couple hundred.
Right.
So I'm getting them pressed, but I don't really like it because I don't feel like, I feel like they'll just, get stuck in the computer and thrown away, basically.
Oh, I know.
For most people.
Well, that's the problem is we've kind of entered a record and erase society where, people just kind of download what they want. And then once they say they need more room or they get tired of it, then they shuffle it off. Whereas to me, I mean, as a diehard record collector, but also a CD collector, to me, the value is always like, apart from someone signing something or something like that, it's just still, I can almost remember where I was when I bought every record. It's just kind of like, oh yeah, I remember I was in the store and I found this, and it's just kind of like it's a mnemonic device. It's an aid to the memory. It helps to keep alive the past. Whereas I think a lot of what's happening now, is there a past or is it all a continuous present? And I think if we lose the past, then we're really in trouble. So, but that is the music biz as it is, and I'm sure it'll wrestle back and forth with things for a while, and we don't know how it'll work out, really.
Yeah, it's crazy.
But anyway, I'm going to I'm going to write my own little essay about Yanka and about your music as well, and then I'm going to probably include this interview, which I've really enjoyed.
Okay, great.
On it,
I have too.
An edited version, not the whole thing, but
sure.
But yeah, it's I'm glad to know there's people like you out there doing that, who are like finding music that we haven't heard and then reinterpreting it. And yeah, it can be dark. I look at Yanka's life as, different people represent different kinds of things. And some people, you read their writing for what you can learn. Other people, you read it because of what it tells you about your times or what it tells you about the human soul. And I look at Yanka's work as more like that. It's almost like a cry in the dark. And that is something we can't afford to lose. I think.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, it's really precious. She's really unique. So, and her legacy is disappearing even in Russia. I mean, people really. It's not like she's famous there. I mean, most people you refer to Yanka, and unless they were, into Soviet rock and pretty seriously into that kind of music, they wouldn't know who you were talking about.
Yeah, and I'm sure that as soon as the West came in, suddenly all the rules changed. So that there was no longer anything special about passing the stuff around, because now you could get anything you wanted, in a manner of speaking.
And Russia is like a very steeped in piracy, so it's
yes.
kind of like China in that way, that everything is free and downloadable.
Черный день, усталый танец пьяных глаз, дырявых рук. Второй упал, четвертый сел, восьмого вывели на круг. На провода из-под колес, да на трибук, из-под асфальта в тихий омут буйной головой. Холодный пот расходится круги. Железный конь, защитный цвет, резные гусеницы в ряд. Аттракцион для новичков, по кругу лошади летят, а заводной калейдоскоп гремит кривыми зеркалами. Колесо вращается быстрее под звуки марша головы долой. На картах трота и семерка, бык хвостом сгоняя мух, с тяжелым сердцем лезет в горы. О, бильярдные шары от столкновения раскатились пополам по обе стороны. По углам простора вишенут. Обрывки праздничных нарядов за полозьями саней, живая плоть чужих раскладов. За прилавком попугай из шапки достает билеты на трамвай до ближнего моста, на вертолет без окон и дверей. Тихий омут буйной головой. Колесо вращается быстрее. А-ха-ха, а-ха-ха,
Thanks for talking.
Alrighty. Okay, keep in touch.
I will, and yeah, we'll do it again.
Okay, bye-bye.
Okay, bye.
Okay, so there you are. I did, in fact, meet Alina again in very interesting circumstances. She came to Georgia and had been coming to Georgia several times in the last few years, and she was covering some of the issues related to the political situation in Georgia here, and she was following one person in particular, whom I hope hasn't been arrested by now. But we won't go into all of that, but just to say, I did get together with her, finally met her in person, which it was like meeting an old friend. And we had great conversations about all sorts of stuff. And so that was great, a great follow-up, 2011 to 2024. But that's the power of staying in touch with people, not obsessively, but just, you're kind of in the background, and you can pull this person out and bring them into the foreground. And that's exactly what Alina and I did. She went from being a person I talked to once, enjoyed the conversation, and then being a person whom we did contact each other enough a bit during that time. But you know how the internet meetings go. You meet someone, maybe you'll share a few emails or something. Maybe you're a Facebook friend, which she became my Facebook friend. And then I noticed one of her Facebook posts saying, so I'm in Georgia now. And I'm like, huh? What? Huh? And then I got in touch with her. And that's how to work it out. You don't want to be obsessively interested in all the people you meet in your life on your travels, because you just don't have time for that. But you need to be, kind of little drips of water on those relationships and then bring them back to life when it is time. So, from Tbilisi, Georgia, which used to also be the Soviet Union, this is Burn Power saying, as we say here, Droebit, which literally just means temporarily, which means we will indeed meet again after a little while. Oh, by the way, I've got a Patreon page now. Go sign up for that. $2 a month to get in, and you get connections with what I'm doing on all my channels and all my media. You need that. Like, share, subscribe, do the stuff, and check out some of the other videos here on the Anadrome. Droebit.
When I go, I want you to give me 5 minutes. I told you boys I'm no escape artist. For the first time, I like the odds.
At the round earth's imagined corners, blow your trumpets, angels, and arise, arise from death, you numberless infinities of souls.
От большого ума лишь с ума до тюрьма. От лихой головы лишь канавы и рвы. От красивой души только струпья и вши. От вселенской любви только морды в крови. Простыне на ветру, по росе по утру. От бесплодных идей до бесплотных гостей. От закрытых дверей до зарытых зверей. От накрытых столов до пробитых голов. Параллельно пути черный спутник летит. Он утешит, спасет, он нам покой принесет. Под шершавым крылом ночь за круглым столом. Красно-белый плакат, эх, заводи самокат. Собирайся, народ, на бессмысленный сход. На Всемирный совет, как обставить нам наш бред, бред, бред. Вклинить волю свою в идиотском краю. Посидеть, помолчать, да по столу постучать. Ведь от большого ума лишь с ума до тюрьма. от лихой